all the restream links to go live. Looks like some of them are working. We should have... See, I see Facebook. I see not Twitch. I see YouTube. It looks like it's going. I'm going to view event, make sure this is working. Looks like it's working. And I got to send... Okay, I'm just going to play the intro while I invite some people here. Okay, sorry. So here we go. Welcome to Dropping In at Pipeline Audio, number 106. And today is going to mostly be a pre-recorded show with a special guest, Ethan Weiner. And if you don't know who he is, he's pretty much one of the premier acousticians in the world. He owns Real Traps. You can always find him giving a lot of advice on audio recording, measuring, dealing with acoustic issues. But to me, he's pretty much the James Randi of audio. He is a huge... We cover a lot of critical thinking, skepticism on this channel. It's pretty much the subject of every single episode, right? But Ethan goes to the Audio Engineering Society shows and really puts his neck on the line, showing that if something can be manifest in the real world, it can be measured. And that there's really a few parameters that we know how to test, we know how to measure, we know whether or not something's actually doing something. And it's important. How many times do you see me taking on the snake oil about mic preamps or special magical cables or, oh, who knows? There's so many claims people make. But Ethan's one of the guys who will go out and test these things. And but before I get to that, I want to put out a huge shout out. I was looking for somebody actually showing the Judas Priest Painkiller solo transcribed accurately. And there are so many hokey versions that have no resemblance at all to what was actually played on that album. And this guy, Rob Peters' channel showed up. I can't remember. I think it was either Thiago Trinci or maybe Tommy Gibbons or was it Will? Will from Metal Method. Somebody pointed this out. He said, you should go watch this guy's channel. And, I put the video on. I'm thinking, yeah, here comes another one of these. But, man, he just nailed it. And then not only did he nail it, but you could see where his fingers are. And we get in all these huge fights all the times on forums about the position you're in makes a big difference. I mean, everybody's got their own styles or whatever, but there's a lot to be gained by looking at what positions and what fingers people are actually using. And he showed the whole thing, and you can ask him for the tab. And so just as a joke, you guys know I'm a huge Meatmen fan, and I've been trying to play that damn rock and roll juggernaut solo for 30 years. What is it? Just on and off. And so as a joke, I put on one of his videos. I'm like, what'll it take for you to transcribe this solo? And he emailed me. And so I was able to buy a transcription at a very reasonable price. I think you guys know, you've seen what the prices are for these things. And you can get a pretty crappy transcription for a whole lot of money. And I just got it today. I've been playing around with it, and I can't wait to just really dive into this. I'm probably going to convert it to Guitar Pro format so I can add rhythm to it, but maybe not. I'm so thrilled to be playing this thing. This is awesome. So anyway, without any more babbling, I'm going to try. Let's see if this works. I'm going to play our pre-recorded video meetup with Ethan. I think most people know that you're the owner of Real Traps, and they can go to your page for a lot of acoustics information. But I don't think enough people understand that you have a lot more to do with critical thinking and reason in audio. And I don't know why you got into that stuff, but if you could just give a real quick intro of who you are and what you do.
Okay, well, I'm Ethan Weiner, and I'm 72 years old, so I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been around the block a few times. For me, this is about consumerism. Most people don't have a lot of money, especially students and kids in their 20s and people still living at home. And even people that are, in their 30s, 40s, have a job and, are successful, still don't have money to waste. So that's really where where my audio skepticism, I guess you'd call it, comes from. There's so many ways to waste money on things that don't matter. And then you overlook things that really do matter, and you don't have money for that because you wasted all your money on nonsense like overpriced wires. I address both home recording type people and also hi-fi and home theater type people. And I understand this is more about home recording, though, the goals are the same, whether it's a hi-fi listening room, a home theater, or a home studio in a bedroom, or, a nice studio in a larger room, or something you set up in your basement. You need accurate monitoring. You want to hear clearly it used to be what's on tape. Now it's, what's in the source signal. And you need to hear it, especially if you're making music. The bass instruments are the hardest to mix, even in a perfect room, which doesn't exist. It's really hard to get the kick and the bass to work together and to get the right level. And uh, and when you're in a typical room, especially, you know, an untreated room without bass traps, it's really, really hard. And the typical problem is you make a mix, it sounds great in your bedroom, you play it in the car, and it's really bassy, or you play it somewhere else or on earphones, and it's all bassy. And yeah, you could try to mix on earphones. There are some problems with that. It's, you know, generally better to, you know, mix on speakers. So, and that's caused by nulls. Most rooms have 1, 2, or 3, or even 4 really bad nulls, all below 300 hertz in the bass range. And so you don't hear all the bass that's in there. So you add too much. I like to think I can tell sometimes when I listen to music, I think maybe I'm fantasizing, but I think I can tell when something was mixed in a room that doesn't have bass traps, because what will happen is certain bass notes will all of a sudden jump out. There'll be a bass line, and 1 note or 2 notes will always stick out. And I think that's because somebody EQ'd those notes or those frequencies. They have a null at 110 hertz, which is, you know, an A note on the bass, and they you know, boosted that because they're not hearing it correctly, and so that and yeah, you can level that out with compression. So anyways, I'm getting off the track, but that's just what matters is acoustics more than gear.
I hope people get a chance to watch your video with the balloons, because that one was like, people think, oh man, I'll just hold my head perfectly still in this one spot in my room. Nope, just turn your head the tiniest bit and you are in a whole nother universe of bass problems. You know, it was just crazy how close together some of those issues were, and just how crazy different things sounded at different parts of the room. It wasn't a little bit, it was humongous, you know.
Right. The response is different even at your left ear and your right ear, you know, not just even moving your head, which is a good thing in that, you know, if there's a really bad null in one ear, it probably won't be so much in the other ear. So at least you'll get to hear it. Now, that's one of the things that's one reason people don't realize how bad things are in their room. You know, a microphone picks up a single source, you know, from the response or whatever is the sound at that single location. So if you're miking a bass amp, well, you know, bass amps and guitar amps, usually the mic is right up against the grill. But, you know, if you're miking things in mono acoustic guitar, you could be a horrible null that you don't hear with your ears because you're hearing it in stereo with 2 different locations at once. But, you know, but just to answer your original question, this is really about consumerism and not wasting money and busting myths. I mean, there are so many myths there, and even, you know, professional engineers who fall prey to this stuff and have magic. You know, really, it's called magical thinking. You know.
It definitely is. You know, so what was it? A couple of years ago, you put out a book called The Audio Expert, and you know, especially for the kids who come here to learn recording, I just tell them, you know, this is kind of required reading. Man, I was wondering if there's any hope of you doing an audiobook of it, read by you.
Well, you know, somebody else asked me that, but you know, the problem is there's like hundreds and hundreds of figures and graphs and waterfall plots and stuff. There are an awful lot of audio examples. Well, actually, those are on the book's website. That's kind of the opposite problem. In a printed book, how do you present audio examples? In an audiobook, you could do that, but you can't show all the graphs and figures and distortion versus frequency. And here's all the distortion components of a typical loudspeaker. So, yeah, probably that's not going to happen. Yeah.
So, you know, I was eventually hoping to do you know, I started a Facebook group called Evidence-Based Audio Engineering, and one of these days I'd really like to have one of these roundtable kind of shows. Like I see a lot. Like I really like. I know a lot of people are gonna nail me for this, but the drunken peasants, you know, they would typically, they used to do like a really secular but angry roundtable, or you know, there's a couple others, a great debate community. But it's something like Pensado's Place, maybe, except for not with magical power cable claims and kind of nutty stuff that they do, where, you know, just like any of the old, they don't really exist anymore, but they used to have all the early YouTube skeptics. You know, you had the, if you're going to bring a claim, you better bring some evidence with it too. And so they would just clown on each other for nonsense, you know, and You know, I think a lot of us think of you as the James Randi of audio, you know, and especially, he died last year, right? That's crazy to think, you know, and I try and be the infidel guy, or maybe the not so eloquent Christopher Hitchens of audio, just to make the forumites mad from time to time, but. I would really love to have some kind of thing like that, like a skepticism, critical thinking, myth busting, and reason in audio kind of show with a couple different people. There's some people who would like to be involved, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm all for debates with people who have these beliefs, because I believe that in a one-on-one, you can explain why they're wrong. It's hard to do in YouTube comments, and I argue with people in YouTube comments too much, waste a lot of time with that. And in audio forums, because, well, for a few reasons. One is people can just ignore something. I mean, you ask a direct question. What specifically do you think is the difference between a real guitar amp and an amp sim? Tell me exactly what the difference is. You're so sure you can tell the difference, and the amp sims suck and real guitar amps are great. What is the difference? Is it the distortion? And they say, well, look, I'm not an engineer, but, and they can, just kind of be evasive, because that's really what it comes down to when somebody believes that MP3s all suck. Well, really? Do you think at 256 or 320 K bits per second, you could tell that from a WAV file? Oh, I could always tell. Okay, well, let's actually do it.
So that's when I think I've seen you get in trouble for it, but I know I do all the time, that there's a forbidden term on a lot of forums, and it will get you banned, especially on the Facebook groups that should know way better. But it's just to say, well, how about an ABX test? And oh man, they go ballistic on that one,
Right. Well, of course, because that will show them. I think some of these people deep down know that they're full of crap. I mean, they have to, because they can't answer. When I ask direct questions, what do you think is the difference? Why do you think this? Here's what I have discovered, and here's my proof. Here's a graph. Here's an article that shows it. Whatever. Why do you? Please defend your position, and they can't. And I'll say, why don't you look in the mirror and ask yourself why you can't answer that? And they come back with some rude, snide, insulting thing, So I think some of them actually know that they're wrong, but then, they can't back down. They've been arguing for a week back and forth in some thread about,
and that's really what it is. And I always say that I'm trying to, trying to protect your wallet from the marketing machine. It's kind of crazy. But last year, was it last year? There was some kind of thing going on through the media where people were insisting it was kind of like the blue gold dress thing, but it was the audio one, and it was what were people hearing, And I tried to get you on the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, because they were talking about it. I'm like, oh great, this is the perfect time to get Ethan on here, and I don't know if they ever talked to you about it, or if it kind of moved on since then, or.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't have an answer for that. I got bit by that too. I thought it was a trick, that when you clicked the video, I thought the server was substituting random audio, because they say if you think that you're hearing this, you'll hear that, and if you think you're hearing, whatever. So I downloaded the video and played it, and we'll load it into, I think, SoundForge or maybe Vegas Video Editor. I forget, but I had the audio track. And so I knew that if I play this clip 3 times in a row, I'm playing the same clip. It's not possibly that they're substituting some randomly ABXing, at the server. And I got fooled. It was true. If you thought you're going to hear this, you heard, and I don't have an explanation. I know it's like those 3D visual optical effects, where if you look at this way, you see, 2 ladies facing each other. And if you look at it, a little different, you see a skull and crossbones, or it's something like that. But I don't know. I don't know how they do that. I don't know how they even discovered it.
Wow. I always make the kids watch your video you had where Poppy, was it Poppy Crumb? She's
Poppy Crumb, yeah.
She's like, okay, this is what you're going to hear. So she primes them. And they're like, yep. Right. And then there's another video where somebody had a whole different set of words, and they said that. And that's what they hear then, So I go, and then, the McGurk effect video too, like your ears are going to fool you.
But the reason this stuff matters is really not to say, well, we don't know everything, but just to show how fragile hearing really is. You change the capacitors in your mixing board, you recap, something that was fine, and now all of a sudden you think that you hear more detail. So to me, that's really the purpose of these kinds of puzzles, is to prove to people that their hearing is not as infallible as they think. I had gotten into an argument with this guy who calls himself Slipper Man in the forums. And this was a Mixer Man forum, and he was Slipper Man. And apparently he was a New York City, hotshot mixing engineer. Nobody knew who he really was. He claimed to be some hotshot. And I'm only an hour and a half from New York. And he insisted that he could hear when a 20 kilohertz low pass filter was put on the output mix bus, meaning everything above 20 kilohertz is being cut off. And he said he could tell that. So I said, I'm sure you can't. I mean, unless you're 14 years old, you probably can't even hear to 18 kilohertz, let alone over 20. And so I said, let me come to New York and I'll come, we'll do it with plugins and we'll test this. And he said, okay. And when I emailed him to set it up, he reneged and wouldn't do it.
I learned you got to be careful with those kind of things, because one of the the JREF $1 million challenge, he had offered it to the pair cable guy, and I was like, no, wait, be careful, because it's trivially easy to show that I could go to Home Depot and grab some lamp cord and make it sound just as good as any good speaker cable out there. But it's also trivially easy to do something to your cable to make it screwed up. And if he does that, he would be able to pick it out every single time. And there's $1 million on the line, So I'm like, okay, so we really, because it's weird, because even he wasn't doing it. I think it was Jeff Wag was actually setting that one up. But they always want to see the good in people, even the crazies, even the people with the claims. It's just weird. But I'm like, no, you got to think, man. If this guy's got $1 million on the line, he's just gonna cut one of the cables, or put like a diode clipper or something in it.
Well, right, and there are things like that. There's something called the Bibi purifier or something, and it's some wire that's got a big lump in the middle, like a snake that ate a mouse, and who knows what's in there? It could be nothing. It could be, like you say, diodes, and that would absolutely give a little bit of a tube sound. I wrote an article for Audio Express magazine that's online. It's linked from my own website, ethanweiner.com. That shows how you can get subtle distortion like you get from tubes and transformers, the kind of mojo that people like, with $3 worth of parts. I mean, the box and the switches and the control, the potentiometer, costs more than the actual couple of diodes and resistors. So they could do that. But when I argue with people, or when I talk about this stuff, I always use the word competent cable. I say you'd never be able to tell the difference between two competent RCA wires or two competent speaker wires. Because yes, if you use one of the hi-fi things I see people do is they use like 30 gauge magnet wire on a 10-foot speaker run. So that's probably going to be audible. I mean, that's going to heat up. It's going to have a lot of resistance. It's going to lower the damping. That's not a competent thing. And also a poor solder connection or a poor crimp, when they crimp on the banana plugs, on the pre-made wires. If they don't crimp it right, you could get distortion. If it's kind of just barely touching, you can get distortion. So I always say competent wires all sound the same.
I should say that. I just say if it's working, a lot of what I do is because it's just kind of my penance. I was raised and educated in and I'll just call it the religion of professional audio at the time. I was able to solder, and I soldered guitars and whatever when I was first learning everything. And there was a call for interns to a really big studio, and I didn't have any tapes that I claimed I mixed or whatever. And the big recording school was almost right next door, and so I had to compete with all these guys that had all these tapes, and their parents had paid for them to go to the school and everything. And I didn't have any of that thing. I just brought my soldering iron and a multimeter, and when the tech saw me, he just sent everybody else home, and so he brought me in. And I was like, wow, I just scored. And the first thing I get is like, the who's who at the time. I had like Megadeth in one room, and We had Stevie Nicks and stuff in the other one, and these were George Augsburger rooms and everything. And I was raised to believe that, you know, there's a something on this mic preamp or this mic, you know, and it's, even though I knew, because I can solder things, and now I had access to all these oscilloscopes and stuff, and I could actually test things, and I would test things, and they would measure exactly the same. And I just but the priests, my teachers, they would tell me that no, we just don't know what to test for yet. There's still a god of the gaps hiding in there someplace, and I believed it for the longest time. And when artists, you know, well, artists got plenty of money, at least back then. But when, you know, maybe the demo bands, people without so much money would want to buy some home studio stuff, I tell them, no, you have to buy this $5,000 channel mic preamp. You got to buy this $10,000 mic. I think I can find one for you and stuff, because I really believed that, even though I was sitting there measuring it with an oscilloscope, and I knew better, I just needed to be beaten. And when Reginald Finley started his well, they weren't podcasts back then, but he started bringing in like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all these guys, and making you really, you know, do you care whether or not your beliefs are true, and you want to have as few false beliefs and as many true beliefs as you possibly can. I said, you know what, I can't agree with you guys anymore, and I can't. This circuit works. You know, I used to be terrified of crossover distortion, of not discrete components. I would take perfectly good working consoles, rip the ICs out of them, and build these insane heat-producing discrete Class A op amps to replace everything with that probably didn't even work as good. Plus, now we needed the special heatsink type air conditioner things that a guy down the street was just loved to sell to everybody, you know, like it was the craziest stuff. And so now this is my penance, you know, you know, it's again, it's the music industry marketing machine versus people's wallets. And, you know, this is what I can pay back if I can, you know?
Right. Well, you know, mic preamps are difficult to compare properly. You have to reuse a reamp setup, so you have a single mic in front of a full range speaker playing something that's got mids, highs, and lows, some kind of full range content, and probably record different things. So it's all exactly the same source, and all you're doing is plugging that mic into different preamps and recording it, to a really clear, clean digital medium. I haven't done that. I've tested a lot of stuff, but Sound on Sound magazine did that a couple of years ago. And I post this all the time when people start talking about mic preamps, and they found, I'll tell you, they found that from the preamp in a $50 Behringer, 2-channel mixer, or the $4,000, Class A, stuff, nobody could tell the difference.
Yeah, well, they picked the Art and the Mackie, so that was the tops in that one.
Didn't they have some they had some really expensive ones?
Yeah,
no?
Yeah, they did, but
yeah. Well, there were two listening tests. First, they tested them, and people absolutely had repeatable favorites, but then they realized that the levels were not matched, and that was the problem. And then when they match, because if something is even a quarter dB louder, it will sound different. It might sound better, it might sound a little worse, depending on if it's too loud or too bright already, because, Fletcher Munson. But when they repeated the test, carefully level matching everything, I don't know if they played sine waves first of the speaker to have a bass line, but then they found that nobody could tell any difference between any of the mic preamps from $50 to, but I've tested A to D converters, sound cards, and I've tested lots of stuff. And the goal for audio equipment, other than when you want to purposely overdrive it to be a fuzz tone, to get distortion, either to glue a mix together or for an effect on a vocal or whatever, other than that, the goal is high fidelity, clean, pure, what we call audibly transparent. So that means if the response is flat enough that you can't tell a difference, and the distortion is low enough that you can't hear it, and the noise is low enough that you can't hear it, then this thing is audibly transparent. Now, if you go through a transparent preamp, something that just barely hits that criteria, into a sound card that just barely hits it, well, now maybe the distortion is 0.12%, maybe a little bit more, but most gear is like so good these days. Even the really cheap stuff is so good that you could go through 5 of them in a row and still be transparent. And I've done that with multiple passes through sound cards, including a $25 Sound Blaster card. And yeah, by the 20th generation, you can definitely tell there's a difference. Not a huge difference. Nothing like, even the finest Studer open reel analog recorder. But people don't test that stuff. Let me just finish most people have not done the work. They haven't tested it. And that's a big part of my audio expert book is there's, I think 180, 90, something like that, audio examples of all the stuff discussed in the book so that people can hear it. With my YouTube videos, including the AES video, I've done 2 of those workshops for the AES and then made videos. I always put the original WAV files on my website and link to them because YouTube has lossy compression, and depending on, I think they even vary it depending on what video you're watching. If you're watching on a smartphone, they may dumb it down, lower bit rate than. I don't know, but that's a variable, and we know that they use lossy compression. So I put the original WAV files. That way people can hear it through their system on their speakers or earphones, and they don't have to take my word for it.
One of the things on that Sound on Sound, when they did that pick a preamp test or whatever, and we see this on the JREF, was whenever somebody, I don't know why it is, it's almost always dowsers that do this. Like, for some reason, dowsing attracts a special type of person. But, they make the test. They agree to the test ahead of time. The JREF doesn't make the test. After they test it, after they say, hey, this is exactly the test I want to do, and of course it fails, then they go away and go, I guess I was wrong. Maybe if you're lucky. A week later, that's when the excuses start. They say, oh, well, guess what? It wasn't like this. And every time somebody does one of these mic preamp tests, there's some kind of God of the gaps, this or that. And so I think it's last year, actually with your help, I was asking you for some stuff so that I could do this. I was actually just running sweep tones through mic preamps and using Room EQ Wizard and thing like that. And I know, for the most part that could be the wrong impedance or there could be issues with this. But one of the things that I found was the dreaded crossover distortion that we're all told you need discrete, not ICs, you need actually discrete transistors so you don't get, was so far down there that, I mean, anybody's room, I don't think anybody's room is going to be quiet enough. Maybe some anechoic chamber or something, but not really, because it was so far down there.
Oh, yeah. And if you think about an integrated circuit, op-amp is made up of discrete transistors. I mean, that's what's inside that. It's just there's a whole bunch of them that are connected together on a single piece of silicon, but it's still the same thing. I made a device called the Null Tester, which I made a video out of, and it's on my YouTube channel, where I did this to definitively and forever prove that a $3 RCA wire is equal to a $1,000 RCA wire. And I tried to get some really expensive RCA wires, and nobody would send them to me. I begged and pleaded in the forums, but one guy sent me a $700 wire, and it had a directional arrow. The audio has to go in this direction. And I proved that was bullshit also by just reversing it. So I made this tester, and I used, I forget, it's OPA 1602 op amps. I forget the exact number. There's an article in the Audio Express magazine linked from my website that has this part of the schematic. And those things have distortion when they're optimized of 0.00015%. So that is like, 130 dB below the music, and of course masked by the music, so nobody could possibly hear that. So, good luck making an analog op amp that's going to beat those specs. It's just not going to happen. And I feel bad for people. Some of these guys have been in the trenches, making really high quality stuff for a long time that sells for a lot of money. And I feel bad for them. I don't want to run you out of business. And if somebody, if Skywalker Sound wants to outfit their stuff with a, 10 manly passive, massive passive, whatever, that's fine. They can afford it. Their clients can afford it. But the kids in the bedroom studios and the students don't have that kind of money, and you don't need to spend money on that stuff. And so that's, you just don't.
It was funny while I was doing this, so I tested I was checking distortion, bandwidth, frequency response, and noise. Those were my biggies. And we had I got just the pedants took me to task over the bandwidth versus frequency response. But I insist they're two different things. One is which frequencies can it actually pass, and the other one is how flat does it pass them. But oh man, I got nailed for that one. But I don't know if there's a better way of saying that. So
well, yeah, and there's also slew rate, which is a third kind of a thing, which, this something could be flat to 50 kilohertz, but at high signal levels, turn up the volume, it can't even do 10 kilohertz without distortion. So that's yet another thing. But, the problem with people testing is it's really hard to do it correctly, and people don't know that it's hard. They want to compare preamps, so they have somebody, their buddy come with an acoustic guitar, and they put a single mic and he sings and plays, or maybe he just plays. And then they swap the preamp or they swap the mic and he plays again. Well, if you move just this much playing the guitar, which of course you're constantly moving as you're playing, then the sound really does change. It's not the mic, it's not the preamp. Well, it might be that also, but it's really hard, and the levels have to be matched, as I said earlier, at least to a quarter dB. I think the professional standard is 1/10 of a dB to really be sure that you're not hearing a difference just due to the volume change. I wrote an article for Live Sound magazine about how to do a proper listening test. And usually, measuring is the right way to go, but sometimes, listening tests like MP3 compression, I don't know what you would even measure with that to see the audibility. So, but it was so involved that they had to split it over two issues. This article, just how to do a proper listening test, with so many words and so many graphs and figures, and how much you can't just do it once, because you could be, oh, well, this is this, listening to this once and that once. You have to be right at least 5 or 6 times in a row to have, like 90-something% confidence that you weren't just guessing or, correct by choice. It's really complicated, and people don't know that. It's what we call the Dunning-Kruger effect. Yeah. They don't know, and they don't even know that they don't know. So they argue from ignorance, and I know what I heard. How do you can't tell me what I know I heard? Well, yeah, I can tell you. And if you're an audio professional like Dave Pensato, and you don't even understand the limits of your own hearing, I pick on him only because of that power chord video he did. That was just disgraceful. Jesus, guys, don't waste $100 on a stupid power chord.
Or more.
or more, right? More. Oh, yeah. I made fun of them I think it was my first AES, right live, at the thing. There were a couple hundred people there. And I said, I was really discouraged to see this crap coming into pro audio. People ought to know better. But sure enough, upstairs, there's some guy selling power chords for $150. And everybody laughed.
With me, a lot of the times, the reason I did, like, especially the DI tests and the mic preamp tests and things with sweeps was that, at least it's apples to apples, and it's not going to change, but I know it's not exactly the right signal for it. But my thing was, if I don't measure a difference, I'm not going to listen for a difference. But when there is something where people say, oh, this adds this thing, it's a better, you got to hear it. And I always ask, if it's a guitar amp and you're actually trying to distort the sound or whatever, that's one thing. But I always ask them, what flavor of broken is always the right flavor of broken for every single source? Like, because they say, oh, if you run it through this console, it's just gonna be that much better. I'm like, what? Even if that console, I mean, I got to speak to Rupert Neve back before he started saying his weird stuff about digital, and if you would have told him back then that, hey, your mic preamp's broken and it doesn't put out what you put in, oh, he would go livid, man. He was like, this is meant to make your mic louder. This is the best path you can take to your tape recorder. He didn't want your stuff broken. I'm kind of now near the end, he kind of did, but.
Well, right. Yeah. Because, right. It's true. And back in the 50s and 60s, designers of this stuff were going for a clean sound. They weren't looking for a tube sound. They weren't looking for a tape sound. The engineers at Ampex and BASF and Scotch were trying to make their tapes have the lowest distortion, the least amount of hiss, the least grunge, the least character or color as possible. But measuring is also difficult. But Room EQ Wizard is actually fabulous for that. I did an article measuring capacitor distortion because people worry about coupling capacitors in interstage inside circuits. I mean, a lot of people don't worry about it, but techie, nerdy people, like guys like us, worry about this. But those capacitors do have distortion, and some capacitors have almost none, and some have really bad, like really bad, 5-10%, but only when there's a voltage across them. A coupling capacitor usually crosses over, because it's really kind of a crossover thing, at 10 hertz, 5 hertz, 20 hertz, something like that. So once you get above that, there's no voltage drop across there. They're passing everything because they're coupling one stage to the next, passing all the audio is going through. So I used Room EQ Wizard to measure the distortion of a whole bunch of different kinds of capacitors, from really cheap ceramics, the kind that are known to have high distortion, to really good, really high quality metal, plastic film caps. And while I was at it, I also measured some transformers. And one of the great things about Room EQ Wizard, besides working this way and being as clean as your sound card, I have a really nice Focusrite sound card that measures, down to 0.000, really low distortion, less than you could hear in the sound card itself. So I was confident. But Room EQ Wizard also lets you separate out the total distortion plus how much is second harmonic, third, fourth, and fifth. And some capacitor types had, the cheap ones had much more odd harmonic distortion. Not that that means anything, but it just was interesting. But when you're measuring things, you also need to measure for IM distortion, because that's actually more damaging than harmonic distortion. And the two are always together. So if harmonic distortion is very low, then you be assured that the IM is low also. But that's something that most people don't measure for or don't know how to measure. There's a couple different standards used, different frequencies.
When I was doing this, I realized there was a lot that I didn't know. One of the funniest things was, I often get accused of. It didn't used to happen so much because I always had pictures of me in front of my racks I had like $1 billion worth of mic preamps. Like every mic preamp you could think of, I had it in my rack. And so I had this stuff, but people would always give me crap. But one of the things we were testing last year was DI boxes. And I always get accused, why are you telling your students or whatever, plug into their Focusrite DI inputs? And if you actually had a real DI, you would know the difference. So I have the gold standard one everybody wants to talk about, the Radial JDI.
Yep.
And when we ran this against the Whirlwind Pro 100, which is a $30 DI, this one and that $30 DI tested the best out of everything compared to the Countryman, compared to the we had one of those Yuri, like really expensive ones. The $30 one did just as good as this one. And I used to do a ABX test to people of transformer versus no transformer, and people say, oh, you can definitely hear transformers, they add all this iron distortion. I'm like, well, I don't know what that is, but obviously you're not hearing it because you can't pick it 30% of the time. You're not even, you guys are down in the realm of chance at this point. And to find out that a $30 DI, I'd been spending all this money on DIs. There are other parts of DIs where there's some reasons, active versus passive and stuff. But
right, there is a difference, and there's also reliability. One of the points I make in my book is if you're at Air Studios or any big studio recording the score for a movie soundtrack, and there's 80 musicians. So the whole thing is costing you $300 per minute. You don't want, some crappy thing that was, wasn't made very well to fail at the worst time and to ruin a take. Not that paying more guarantees better assembly. I
was going to say there's some really good examples of that too.
Right.
What was funny was that this stuff that's kind of looked down upon by recording engineers, stage equipment, stuff that has to work every single time, because stage stuff is crazy. Like the people are fanatical. Like the live sound guys are if they can't put it on the ground, run it over with their truck, and it still works, they don't want it, And this
They're brave.
Yeah, this $30 DI was one of those things, like you could, I mean, I'll throw that on the ground before I'll throw this Radial JDI on the ground. I guarantee, So it's funny. Some of their mic preamps too, like measured perfectly flat and no distortion, no noise. But everybody goes, "Oh, that's a live one. That's a piece of crap." I'm like, whatever. It worked fine.
Right, well, because they have biases, they have prejudices.
Yeah.
They never tested it properly. They read this crap in the magazines.
Yeah.
The hi-fi magazines are the worst, but the pro audio magazines, I write for a bunch of them. So, well, the pro audio magazines too, or the home recording type magazines. I'm not going to name any of them because I write for some of them. I stopped for a couple that pay 15 cents a word. Give me a break, but I see more crap. Even Sound on Sound that used to be really good. Now is off into the subjective world of fancy sounding words, even though their own mic preamp article, which was groundbreaking a couple of years ago, proved, beyond doubt, with 30 listeners or whatever they had, that they all sounded the same. Nobody could tell the difference. I still now see Hugh Rob Johns, saying, "Oh, and this has a full clear sound with a full bottom end." Well, all this stuff is just frequency response. If it's flat, then of course it's going to have a full bottom, round end with a clear top. Come on, guys.
And that's this is where I get in a lot of trouble. But when somebody's wanting to buy something in a forum, they talk about things. These guys will make it like there's this huge difference between these two things. And every time somebody says something like that, I'll say, okay, there's a couple parameters you could show. So what is it? Does it have less noise? Does it have more bandwidth? Does it have a flatter frequency response? What is the difference? And they will never say. It'll always be crickets. But if you're going to bring a claim like that, you better bring your evidence.
Right. I know what I hear. Well,
I know what I hear.
Right. I mean, it's always that, or I'm not an engineer. I had a guy today on one of the YouTube comments say, "Well, I'm not an engineer, but you're not a psychologist." So I says, "Well, actually, my dad was a psychotherapist, and I actually happen to know quite a bit about that, at least especially as relates to this kind of stuff, expectation bias and placebo effect and things that affect how we think we perceive audio." So, but, earlier we were talking about overdriving preamps for an effect. Now, personally, I leave all those kinds of decisions to the mixing phase, because if you distort a guitar, that you don't want a fuzzy guitar, you're playing rhythm, but you want a little edge to it, a little grit. You don't really know what it's going to sound like until after you've had the drums, the bass, if you're, typical kind of home recorders doing all the parts one by one overdubs. So I record everything clean, and I would rather add that kind of stuff later. But some people, there's also the philosophy, no, you got to be confident and you got to know what you're doing and you got to go for a sound. So I always say, well, then patch your effect into the playback path and then monitor through that. Right. With low latency fast computers today and low latency sound cards, you can absolutely monitor through an EQ and a distortion, whatever, phaser effect. But you're still recording it clean, but you're hearing it and you're inspired by what you hear. And you can quote commit, but you can still change your mind. So, right. But the point I was getting at is I'm working now on what might or might not be a commercial product, a fuzz tone effect. And I know there's a million fuzz tones out there, and but I have an idea that I think would be pretty cool. Plus, the real unique thing about this is it's on a tiny. In fact, I have a part of a prototype here.
Oh, you could fit that in a guitar.
Yeah, exactly. And I used to do this 50 years ago when I was in my 20s. I built circuit hardly bigger than this with a couple of transistors, and built them into people's guitars. I think I charged $25, and I did like 20, 30 of them. And I also made compressors, and so it's kind of a neat thing. So you can just flip a switch on your guitar, or I'm going to probably have where you replace the volume control and you pull up on the volume control to get distortion.
Oh, perfect.
But as I'm trying different things, there's some circuits overdrive and sound good when you distort, and some just kind of fart and don't sound good. So I suppose that could be considered a real difference between preamps. If you're overdriving them, trying to get fuzz, a distortion or grid or color or glue, whatever you want to call it. Some preamps may overdrive more pleasantly. Of course, that's subjective. What you like might not like, but you can't argue. If somebody says, no, I like the way Neve overdrives, I tried overdriving, the Mackie and it sounded like ass. Yeah. That's fair. And it may be the other way around. This cheap Behringer, man, it just fuzzes great. When I tried it with the expensive whatever, it farted out. So that's, I guess, one thing. But though I don't record that way, I record clean and
that's when I always have the caveat that when these devices are operated in their linear range, one of the early ones, like, speaking of sound on sound, when I was one of the creators of the Reaper digital audio workstation, and in the early days of that, the DAW summing myth was still out there, and I could actually make pathological files that would sound different in some different DAWs, but that was really just because some of the industry standard one was still using fixed point math back then, and so I could overdrive there were a couple of places where the audio was summed down to a smaller bit rate, bit depth.
Right, I know, yeah, right.
But you had to,
and then brought back up again after, right?
You had to purposely go way out of your way to make this thing different, right. But in any sane test, all these DAWs would null, but that wasn't enough. Like when Sound on Sound was the first magazine, they all said, "Hey, we'll review Reaper for you." And so we had agreed early on that we weren't going to spend a penny on marketing the thing. No advertising, no marketing, none of that. And so that should have held us back, but eventually Sound on Sound said, "You know what, we're just gonna talk about this," and they did, and they put us in there. And then there's people in the forums where they were talking about, because we did kind of take a science-based approach to that DAW, and they were saying, hey, these guys keep saying there's no real difference between DAW summing, but just because it nulls doesn't mean they don't sound different. And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure how we're going to get past this, because if you can't hear anything, how are they sounding different? He goes, well, you can't hear anything when you're nulling them, but when you're listening to them individually, they sound totally different. I'm like, I don't think that's how that works, man. So
right.
I don't know.
Well, but to be clear to people who are watching us talk about this, you got to really explain what nulling is, which is you take a signal and you invert it so it's 180 degrees out of phase. Well, it's not really out of phase; it's inverted.
Yeah.
So
you're about to get in trouble by the pedantic polarity police, so be very careful with that.
So when the signal goes plus half a volt, the inverse goes down half a volt. When you mix them together exactly equal volume, it has to be exact, then you get silence. And I have a video I mentioned before. I made this Null Tester device that proves that these RCA wires, I tested 4 different ones. I also tested XLR wires, really overpriced to cheap ones, but I didn't put that in the video because it was already half an hour long. But if you watch that, it's a really good explanation of what null testing is. Also my 2 Audio Engineering Society videos, all this stuff is on my YouTube channel, explain all of this and shows, with graphs. It's all plain English. I'm not a math guy. If you developed worked on developing Reaper, you are way ahead of me on that stuff.
Oh, no,
I know how this stuff works.
I'm just the bridge between the coders and the audio engineers on that one. But we did do a lot of testing.
But I'm not a math guy, but I know how this stuff works, and I can explain it. And in fact, that's kind of it's maybe even a benefit because I need things explained in plain English without formulas. So many articles that purport to this is going to teach you how an EQ works. Right away, they get into really advanced math, and you don't need that to understand how an EQ works. This is what my audio expert book is all about. It's like 800 and something plus pages of how audio gear really works. It has the usual, here's how you use it, but how stuff really works, and difference between an opto compressor and other types, and actually show circuits. It's got basic introduction to electronics, but it's all plain English. Not to turn this into a sales pitch, but this is what people need. A lot of people don't want to learn math. I don't want to be bothered. Not at my age, you know, I'm not, but you don't need that. What you need is just plain English, you know, with mechanical analogies. You know, resonance is you could have a, you know, a ball hanging on a spring, a lead weight, and you bounce it up and down and the thing goes up and down. Well, that's resonance. It might be 2 hertz, but that's the same thing as resonance, clapping your hands in an empty bedroom and you hear, blah, 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 you know, between the 2 walls. It's all the same thing.
You know, one of the ones you've said a little bit about this over the years, but one of the ones that burns me up more than, you know, me, Jim Roseberry, and I don't know if you ever seen him, Jim Kirgliano. He does a thing called DAW Bench where he actually tests audio interfaces against each other, mostly for the drivers, because nobody wants to admit it, but they all sound so damn good right now that the big difference is how they're going to perform, what kind of latency they're going to put out, how much CPU they're going to eat at that latency, and how low of how many plugins you can run at a low latency test. And so he does this DAW Bench benchmark test. I do a round trip latency benchmark test. Jim Rosenberry builds piles and piles of these DAWs. So we know that side pretty well. So when people are talking in the forums and just making nonsense claims about audio interfaces, which is usually what people are asking, is this Focusrite 2i2 okay? And we're like, well, you know, go to my page where I actually test all this stuff. And yes, it's very much okay. It's okay versus the $1 billion mic preamps that I got sitting in my studio. But the one that just burns the hell out of me is that some guy says, hey, I have this guitar and I'd like to put this pickup in it. And then the whole forum jumps on him. No, you stupid kid. That's a mahogany body guitar. You can't put that EMG pickup in a mahogany body guitar. It's going to sound horrible. I'm like, oh man, do you guys have any evidence for this? And the whole guitar world, the bass world isn't that bad. They seem to be at least in the 1980s or 1990s. But man, the guitar world just goes crazy. You have no idea what you're talking about. This wood will not work with that pickup. And I'm like, you know what? Go out to your car right now. Take off your hood. Make a wooden version of your hood. And then try turning on your headlights and see if your alternator still works. Because to me, most of an electronic, I'm not going to get nailed for this. Ethan takes no responsibility for this. So anybody listening, don't take this out on him. But to me, an alternator and a pickup have so much in common. I mean, I don't care if you have a wood hood on your car. Your alternator's still going to work, you know? You can take that out of the car and it's still going to work.
Well, I can address a little bit of this. First of all, you're talking about a solid body guitar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about magnetic pickups too. I'm not talking about piazzas.
No, I understand. But you're in a guitar that's made out of ash, you know, like the Fenders or Telecaster or mahogany. But you're talking about the solid body. Because I remember people arguing about paint coats and finishes on a solid body guitar.
Nitro versus
difference. Now, of course, if you think about it, the weight of and the solidity and mass of the guitar is 1,000 times more than whatever little tiny bit is added by the finish. So the finish can't matter. Now, on a violin, the finish can matter because that's a really thin resonating box and it's meant to vibrate. So the finish can. I'm not saying it does. I don't know, but I don't know if it's been tested scientifically. But on a solid body guitar, the finish can't matter. But certainly the density of the wood can matter. But that's not going to be, as you say, a function of the pickup. That's good. So a heavier, more massive guitar like a Les Paul probably has more sustain. Just plucked open low E string, probably ring for 45 seconds before it decays 60 dB or whatever, where on a Telecaster might only go 35 seconds. I'm just pulling these numbers out of my butt, but that wouldn't affect how the pickup responds, which is, of course, your point. I'll just make one last point. I have a Telecaster that's not quite pre-CBS. It missed being pre-CBS by a couple of years. I don't care because I don't go for that. It's a fabulous guitar. I've had it since, this 1970, 68, 71, whatever. And I also, a few years after that, bought a Fender Precision bass. Now, I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'8", and my hands are not particularly big. And at that point, Fender Precision basses had a big fat neck, and the jazz basses had a really thin, slim neck. And I struggled with this precision bass neck for a year, and finally I realized, I should just get a jazz bass neck and put it on. It has I don't know, maybe 3/4 of the mass. I mean, it's definitely not as wide, and it's not as thick this way. It's narrower, at the. And I immediately noticed, this was not placebo effect, that the bass did not have as much sustain.
No.
But at least I could play it, and I've had this now for 50 years, 45 whatever, 45 years, and it sounds fine. I mean, I record with it all the time, but so that stuff matters. But yeah, I certainly agree with you that the pickup, if people believe stuff, and the problem with the guitar finish is it's impossible to test.
Yeah, you can sand the guitar to test.
You can't use different performances because every time you strum, it's a different speed. It's your different distance from the bridge, even an eighth of an inch difference. It's a different hardness, how hard you're strumming. So if you record yourself, unless it's a really obvious difference, like a bridge pickup versus a neck pickup, which no matter how you play it, you're going to hear the difference. But with subtle differences, the difference in how you strum, so you strum and you record it, and then you take the strings off, you take the whole guitar apart, you take off the neck, you refinish scrape the body, do this, and 3 weeks later, you put it all back together, even with the same strings, if they were kind of new or whatever they were. And now you play again. That's just not a proper comparison. I told you it took 2 magazines, spread across 2 magazines, this article, that goes into all this stuff. You can't compare separate performances. You can't move the mic. It has to be done by reamping if you're comparing preamps and things like that. I have a plumb bob. I don't think you can see it. It's actually a 1/4 inch guitar plug hanging down on a string, so just a couple feet behind my head. I don't know if I can get the... Yeah, you can see it there. And I dropped that down. Not going to get this back to where it was. When I'm doing critical, come on, jeez. See what I did?
Doesn't matter.
When I'm doing critical room measuring things or comparisons between speakers, I'm just getting ready to do make another short article about on and off axis response. In the hi-fi world, some people put their speakers facing straight ahead, and they shouldn't be. They need to be pointed at you. That's where you get the most accurate responses, when the speaker is right at you. And the same thing if you have speakers that are above you or below you. So I'm going to do a little article about that. So that's what I use that plumb bob for. It comes down here, and I put my measuring mic. I have a precision DPA, one of those with a tiny diaphragm. It's like the Earthworks, but it's a DPA. And I can put it just like that, and I can get it exactly back to the same spot.
No,
each time in the same height.
Yeah, and you're not going to do that with 2 different guitar performances ever. I mean, there were some pretty novel tests where people would make these little swinging contraptions so that they could. There's a guy on YouTube where he just has the middle of a body with the pickup in it, and then he'll slide different guitar bodies onto it and bolt them on there and show. Because I mean, there's a couple where a guy takes nails into concrete, puts a pickup on the concrete, screws a bridge into the concrete, puts some tuners on the other side. Sounds pretty good. So I was wondering, is that going to make a difference in sustain? Because if you have a big mass, but it's not going to, I mean, it's still not going to, you could, I don't think it's going to, well, and that's the thing about that subtle differences, right? If the difference is subtle, I don't care. But when you're talking, if it's a subtle difference between a $50 mic and a $5,000 mic, or if it's a subtle difference between mic preamps, or a subtle difference, even if there was some difference between the what goes through the pickups on these different woods, it's not up to the level where you guys are freaking out on some guy who just wants to record his guitar, and you would never, ever in a billion years be able to ABX a difference. And one of the things that I do is I have gear that manufacturers send to test or for the kids or whatever, and we don't need it anymore. And I offer it as a giveaway. If you guys can beat this ABX test, you get this guitar or you get this amplifier or whatever. And every once in a while they win it because I do the test wrong, or I'm wrong. Turns out they can tell the difference. But we do these giveaways all the time, and it's just crazy because never do the pickup guys ever dare challenge it. It's just crazy.
Well, the entire sound of an electric guitar is the strings vibrating, and the sustain is purely a function of the mass. Now, with a hollow body acoustic guitar, those aren't like as thin as a violin. Those are still pretty thick pieces of wood, but there's some resonance that can affect the sound. And also, when you're playing through an amp, the sound in the air, if the amp is loud enough, gets into the guitar through the F holes or round hole, depending on what kind of a hollow body electric guitar is, or an acoustic guitar with a magnetic pickup, and that can also influence the sound. But with a solid body, it's all about the mass. Think about a grand piano. Those things are really, really heavy because it's a huge, massive block of wood, and even more massive iron. They call it the harp-shaped thing. That because it's like 15,000 pounds on a like on a Steinway Grand. Of tension. So this is this huge, massive thing, and that's why you bang a note on the piano and it's going to sustain for a long time because of the mass. And there's very little frictional loss at the end junctions.
That's interesting. So yeah, I never really understood. I remember watching tests where people would compare neck joints, and one guy was able to show that a properly done bolt-on, he would actually get a little bit more sustain than a neck through, which I always thought would be the opposite way. But he had some reasons for it. I forget what it was, and then some physics guy said, "Oh, that makes sense." But
well, it draws energy away from the string. If the string is absolutely anchored really securely at both ends into with nails or screws into a massive wood block or something, then the string is going to keep going until the friction with the air slows it down. But if it's on a you have a yardstick, kind of flimsy wood with some screws, and you tie a string. Well, the yardstick is going to vibrate. Well, that's sucking energy out of the string. That some of it goes through the end, the end anchors that you tied to screws or whatever, and is making the wood flex. So that's sucking energy out of the string. So the string will die out faster. And that's why I say mechanical analogies, and you don't need math to understand this. You don't need physics. You could express all this with formulas. I don't do that. I wouldn't understand them if I saw them, but you don't need that to understand. This is how this stuff works.
So why are most guitars still made out of wood? That's what I want. I don't want my neck bowing and flexing from different weather and stuff. Like this carbon fiber stuff makes sense, but I've seen the aluminum guitars, man. They look good. What's wrong with it?
Yeah, probably nothing, to tell you the truth. I've never seen one. I've heard carbon fiber cellos. I spent about 10 years in the cello world in my 40s and got into that really quite deeply. And the carbon fiber cellos sound really good. Maybe not quite as good as wood. I heard two different ones, and I've heard a lot of really good wood cellos and a lot of really crappy ones made out of plywood or just not well made. But I don't, just like bats always used, baseball bats always used to be wood, and now don't they make them out of aluminum?
Yeah. I don't know if that's the ones that use it. But, and that's why I think so much of this stuff is tradition. I always wonder about what is doing that.
Right. Well, a bat needs to have some flex. I mean, it needs to bow. I'm not a baseball player, so I don't know how it feels as the bat flexes and bends a little as you hit it, versus aluminum that I guess you could get the right thickness and make it bend the same. But with a guitar, I know that you just want mass. You want mass and weight and rigidity, mass and rigidity.
When I told people I'd be talking to you sooner or later, one of the ones that came up, and I saw it's actually on your site, was about these speaker isolation pads that if you don't buy them, everybody in every professional got the special sideburns and the proper lip rings and stuff will tell you that you're a noob if you don't have the Auralex or the Mopad thing underneath your speakers. What do these speaker isolation things do besides point your speakers at the direction you want them to be pointed?
Right. Well, I can tell you they don't do anything, and that's and this is probably what I get the most heat over, because I tested them and I tested them properly. I had to actually do it several times to get good data, because it's so difficult. Again, because there's different isolation. I tested I think 7 or 8 different devices, including a couple of do-it-yourself things, but each one is a different height, and I had the microphone 3 feet away. But it was really hard to get each speaker in the same position. I had to put little crosshairs and look down on the speaker and get the height exactly right.
Wow.
It was really difficult. But first of all, let me just address the angle thing, because loudspeakers, I was just mentioning before, I'm getting ready to do an article about speaker angles. Having the speakers too high and pointed down is not good, because when you're here at one specific spot, then you're right on axis. But as you move forward, or back, now you're in and out of axis, because you just different, your ears are changing. So speakers, the tweeters should be exactly at ear height and pointing at you, and toed in, pointed at you at an angle, and that's really important. Now, it's true that as you slump down or sit up or move left and right, that's going to change, but at least it doesn't change as you move forward and back. So you've eliminated one variable, because people kind of lean forward and their arms down. Well, you can't see my arms, and you lean back when you're going to listen more relaxed. So that is could be a problem. But the problem with the isolation, the reason the sound does change, but only because the speaker height changes, especially with like those isoacoustic things that raise them up 6 inches. And their demo video is just complete nonsense, where they had 2 different speakers, a pair here, the pair here, and this pair was on the isolators, and this one isn't. And of course, the sound changes. And I have articles on my website, ethanweiner.com, that show the difference with a microphone here. I was measuring a room. I was actually measuring bass response at the listening position, like 4 feet away from the speakers, and moved the mic 4 inches. Completely different, even as low as 23 hertz, 30 hertz. I forget how low we went. The response was different. At 70 hertz, a null became a peak 4 inches away. And people think, well, the wavelengths are 14 feet long at those frequencies. It can't possibly change, but it does, because of all the reflections, competing reflections bouncing all around the room. And people don't realize that. So when the speaker goes up a couple of inches, the sound really does change. It's not because your desk isn't resonating, but the real proof is that a competent speaker cabinet will not vibrate. They, good speakers, not crappy, stuff, but good speakers, not plastic, things that come on a cheap boombox, but real speakers have like 1 inch MDF or 3/4 inch, they're braced with cross pieces and vertical pieces in the corners, so that if you play loud, bassy music and you rest your hand on it, you shouldn't really feel anything. So if the speaker cabinet isn't vibrating, then there's no vibration to be coupled to the desk surface it's resting on. And before I actually had Real Traps, my acoustic treatment company, this is 20 years ago, Oralex sent me a pair of Mopads, and I brought them to a friend's house. He had a pair of Mackie HR 824 speakers. And this is, like 20 odd years ago. And we put the speakers, and he had a kind of a flimsy top shelf on this desk thing. We couldn't hear any difference. And so I immediately ruled it out. And maybe I didn't listen carefully enough, because it did. Well, the Mopads are only like 1 inch high. But, some of these things are much higher.
There's some pretty contraptionistic Rube Goldberg speaker isolators out there, man. You have the spring loaded and
I've gotten some real bad blowback from people, and I said, look, they said, well, your test is wrong. So I said, well, how's my test wrong? Well, I don't know, but I know what I hear. It's always back to that. I got into such a spat with Bob Katz that he unfriended me on Facebook. He got so mad because he really hates when people disagree with him. And I like Bob. I love Bob. He's great.
He's the guy who would bust all the digital myths, man.
Right. He's 90% into real science and hard evidence and empirical proof, and 10% into the magic fairy dust stuff. And he finally he did a test, and his test was obviously wrong, but the speakers are these massive 200-pound mammoths in his main room, his main mastering room. So he wasn't willing to redo it, but he said he measured with a laser measuring thing, and it was within 1,000th of an inch. And the graphs with and without isolation were so different that it was just obvious it was wrong. So he did it again a couple of years later, which was just recently, and he wrote an article for the Journal of the Audio Engineering Society. And his conclusion was that, speaker isolation does matter, but when you look at the graphs, it was like 0.5 dB at this frequency, and it was like 3 milliseconds of reverb change, from 300 milliseconds to 302, meaning it was, the mic was a little different, the speaker was maybe really close, but when, so yeah, I love Bob, and one of these days he'll know or not.
Yeah. Some people have these unsinkable rubber ducks, and I know I did for the longest time. Like before I really went and explored this how pickups actually work, I was sure that maple fingerboards were brighter than rosewood fingerboards. I was absolutely positive, and that
brighter really, sound. You mean a brighter sound
through the pickups, though. Through the pickups. Yeah, and it wasn't really until I said, wait, how exactly do pickups work? Is it because I'm so used to microphones on everything, But not right. That I had actually gone and mic'd up a maple fingerboard to see if it was brighter. That's the thing. Unless you already know there's a difference, you what's the man? See, I violate my own rules, And that's why I
can help. It's not going. I don't think it's going to be the wood, assuming it's a solid, reasonably solid wood, not some spongy stuff or balsa, but two competent woods. There's that word competent. I think it's probably more the frets, because when you fret the guitar, nothing is touching. Yeah, you're pushing it down against the neck, but that's on the other side, on the not on the active side of where the string is vibrating. So it's probably more, and I know Gibson guitars, I think, have higher frets than the Fenders, or at least I've seen higher frets on some Gibsons. So I think it's more of that. You're pushing down, it's harder, it's up a little higher, maybe a little, so that could change the sustain. So I don't think it would be the wood, but I could see it being the frets. I'm not saying it is, but I could see that.
It was psychological for me. It was because if I go to record something and I see that the drum set is sitting on carpet, I'm kind of bummed. It really depends though. But if I take a snare drum, put it on a carpet, and I hit it, I get one sound. If I go on a wood floor or a good laminate floor or concrete floor and I hit a snare, I get a way different sound. So that's how I was looking at that fingerboard thing, like thinking that the maple is hard and the rosewood is just a porous sponge. It was wrong. It's not.
Right. With the drums, you have acoustic source, the snare, the bottom side facing down to this bright reflecting thing. It's, of course, going to get picked up by the overheads. Maybe it'll be shielded by the top snare mic, depending on where it is. But, when you were talking before about, if it's just this little tiny difference, and the little differences here with fingerboard woods, you can EQ that stuff. I mean, we're talking if it's a dB of difference, that's what EQ is for. And another thing I get a lot of heat for is somebody who, in one of the student forums, Facebook groups, clearly doesn't have a lot of money. He says, "Here's what I got in my mother's." I'm living with my mother. Here's my bedroom, and asking about a microphone. I could spend up to $500, or I could spend up to $1,000 on a microphone. What should I get? I say, get an Audio Technica 2020. It's $100. It's a U47 for $100. It doesn't have the switchable pattern, so it's cardioid only, but you're basically getting a U47 for $100. And boy, does that make people pissed. Yeah. I mean, oh my God, they just hate that. And so I said, well, what specifically is the difference other than maybe small different, they both are like 1-inch diaphragm, 1.25 inch, both large diaphragm condenser mic, the same kind of thing. Other than, small differences that could be EQ'd to match. What's the difference?
And you'll get crickets.
Right, crickets, of course, but just anger. Well, I know what I hear. Or it's the logical fallacy known as argument from authority. Well, why do you think all the famous engineers have U47s? Well, yeah, right, Ethan. Sure, if you were right, they'd all just get a bunch of Audio Technica 2020s. So I say, well, okay, that's not a point, though. It's called argument from authority. Yeah. Well, this guy does that, so therefore it must be true.
That's part of our kids. Have to go to your fallacy is and see which ones are being applied to the we do the argument ad populum Britney Spears Black Sabbath thing. So we say, well, Britney Spears sold more albums than Black Sabbath, so she's obviously better, right? So right. we try and keep them up on all the fallacies. Vern Grainer, who's now Right now, he's the president of the atheist community of Austin. They do a lot of different TV shows. He does a lot of crazy broadcast stuff, but he's a really good broadcast engineer. And there's a video of him where this girl came on mostly to talk. You know, they use AT2020s as all their around the table mics, you know, for them to talk, all their guests. But she decides she's going to play her guitar. And it sounded like somebody took a pair of mics and put them right in the exact spot on the guitar. Nope, it's still sitting way out away from her, out on the edge of the table where they were when they were talking. And just the skill of the engineer to actually pull this off, and the song sounded unreal. She was singing and playing her guitar, and it's just amazing what a good engineer can do with the mic. And that's a cheap mic, but it's a great mic, you know.
It is a great mic. And when I started doing this in the 60s and 70s, you really had to spend a lot of money to get good stuff. You know, you could buy an electric condenser mic at Radio Shack for $30, and they were okay, but they weren't like a U87, which was, I think, $800, $750, $900, something like that. And I've had all these mics. I mean, I've had all the famous mics: the 247, U87, MD421s for toms, and the D112 for kick. I mean, you know, I had the largest studio in the state of Connecticut for a number of years. Built that in took 2 years from 1978 through 79. We opened up in January of 1980. And we had all this stuff, a Lexicon Primetime, a Eventide Harmonizer, and we had all this stuff, all the Keypex and Game Brain, you know, compressor and gates and all this stuff. And I built a ton of stuff. All this stuff and stories about this and pictures of all this is on my website, ethanweiner.com. There was a point that I was going to make, you know, I forgot.
That mics, you know, we used to have to pay a pile for them, but they don't anymore.
Oh, right,
you know?
Right. Now with high quality stuff made in Asia and elsewhere, and right.
And I always got to ask them, that AT2020 is a piece of crap, huh? What's wrong with it? You know, tell me, is it the frequency response? Is it the noise? Is it the distortion? What is it? And they'll never have it, you know. And that really, man, I mean, I remember this one. This was the thing when you told people that when you went and measured a Sound Blaster, that it measured better than a Studer, and everybody's heads came off.
Right.
So that's the studio cat.
Well, I have 3 cats. This is Lily. Say hello, Lily.
That was a grumpy looking cat.
No, she's an angel. She's the best cat I've ever had. She's the smartest. She's really precocious. She's adorable, but boy, does she make trouble. She is constant mischief. I have 8-foot-high absorbers, fabric absorbers on the walls here in my studio, and she climbs right up them and climbs right up on top, you know. Oh, wow. and she makes a lot of trouble. Hello, sweetheart. Okay, she just woke up. So she's not grumpy. She's just sleepy.
But yeah, I remember that Sound Blaster thing, and you put up some specs, and we're like, you know, my boss was freaking out because I would almost always use the we had a Sony 3348 as a one of the early digital reel-to-reels, like a 1/2-inch one, and I would almost always use that instead of the Studers that we had. And he's like, you can't let people see you using that. That's only for when people bring in those tapes. I'm like, thing works great, man. I can punch in like syllables and stuff, you know, and I don't know what's wrong with you guys, but it wasn't great, I'm sure, but the Sound Blaster is probably better than that too.
Well, the Audio Technica 2020 is arguably better than a 47 because it doesn't have a transformer. It's not going to change as it warms up, you know, if you got a tube.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I guess now, of course, it's a 47 FET. I was arguing with somebody. Somebody was insisting, a guy, Dan Alexander, who sells vintage gear, and we're pretty much past it now, but we were arguing back and forth in a Facebook group, a student group of all places, for like a week. But he sells vintage gear, and he gets really mad. And he kept making the point that no serious engineer uses a U87. And I remember that was like pretty much our go-to mic for almost everything, for vocals and for vocals and anything, you know. So I don't know, maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, you never know with the absolutes type statements like that.
Well, you know, I bought an Audio Technica 4033 when they first came out, and this was quite a while ago, 15 years ago, more than that, and they were 20 years ago, and they were $650. But at that time, a U87 was like $3,000 or $2,500, something like that. And an AKG 414 was similar. So I was sort of friends with the guy at this music, professional audio place about 40 minutes away. And he let me take home a U87, a 414, and these new 4033s from Audio Technica. And that's when I was really into the cello. And I have a nice cello. My cello teacher at the time has a really nice cello, really nice. I mean, it sounds like a Strad. It's not, but it's really that level. And we tried all three of them, all three mics on both of our cellos with her playing mostly. And we liked the 4033 best. A year later, they were down to $350, so I bought the second one, not a matched pair, but it sounds the same. I mean, I don't even know which one of the two I'm using now. I have this right beside me here, and so you don't have to spend that kind of money. No. If you have it and you want it. My Real Trap's partner, Doug Ferrara, has a home studio, and he records bands and singer-songwriters. He does a lot of production. Somebody will come in and sing, sing and play guitar, and then he'll add drums and bass and turn it into a whole production. As he has a business doing that. So he bought a TLM 103 when they first came out, and this is again 15 years ago. And I had my 4033, and the 4033 is very, very flat. I mean, it's just it's not a large diaphragm; it's a medium diaphragm. I think it's about the size of a quarter or a nickel, something like that, 3/4 inch instead of 1 inch, and not real small, like 1/4 inch. It's very, very flat, and the TLM has a presence boost, up around 3 kilohertz. So we put two of them, and I know that's not exactly the same, but we had them in a two mics, and I sang into one and sang into the other, back and forth, and they sounded different. So we looked up the curve, the data sheet, and he had we dialed in that EQ, and then we couldn't tell the difference. Awesome. Now, this wasn't a truly scientific test, but it proves that most of these differences, when people hear differences, it's usually frequency response, and that's the main thing that we hear, not so much ringing and distortion unless it's obvious. 5% distortion before you really hear it. So you can EQ things to sound like that. Yeah. If you have a small difference. Or
when now with the amp sim world really it's incredible how much work is being done in this stuff. It's kind of mind-blowing that as much as we think that these distortion circuits are so different, the big fat deal when we're doing all this profiling and matching and stuff is usually just to put a different impulse response on, and basically that's an EQ curve, and that's where these giant differences are coming out. There are still some circuit differences that you can change, but for the most part, when people are listening and not playing, the impulse response is really what ends up mattering. It's just mind-blowing that all this stuff you really thought was such a bunch of different non-linear things turns out just to be an EQ, which is pretty incredible.
I'll tell you a funny story. I mentioned that I'm working on designing a new fuzz tone that will fit into guitars, but I'm doing some, hopefully will be pretty clever things that make a neat sound. So I have the first stage is just making the distortion. Then I'm going to shape it with filters, and probably have the filters actually change frequency as you play different notes. I'm not going to turn this into like a speech synthesizer or a wah-wah dropping a Marshall stack, because that's a cool sound too. But there'd be some filtering involved. So I took the raw, just the first stage where it just distorts it, and nice smooth sustain, maybe a little harsh sounding, but that's the sound. And I sent it to a friend of mine who's better than me with the ears and EQ and stuff. And I also have, and you've probably seen these floating around, the raw master tracks for various commercial songs. I have the raw tracks for the Queen, Killer Queen, and also Bohemian. So I grabbed a piece of Brian May's guitar from Bohemian Rhapsody and a piece of one of his licks from Killer Queen. And I learned those licks. I practiced. I play the guitar. Used to be really good. Now I'm only, but practiced enough to be able to play it, and sent them to him. He's got it was one of the Isotope things modules has EQ matching. Right. Because I said I know that it's really just an EQ difference, but they really sounded different with Mike playing it and him playing it, besides him being a little more polished. So he put it through, and son of a gun, they're not exactly the same, but they're basically the same. And the sound from the Killer Queen and the Bohemian Rhapsody, there were different guitar sounds. So it was different EQ curves. And this isotope module shows what EQ it applied. And it applied really detailed stuff, but you can dumb it down and, I see it's basically a resonance here and rolling off the highs, there and whatever. This was experimenting. I'm not trying to make a Brian May fuzz tone. Maybe I should. But so so I now know exactly what to do to get his sound, or one of his sounds out of, my fuzz tone. And it's EQ. That's my whole point, is it was EQ. Somebody once asked me in a forum when I was saying that, look, it's really all frequency response, EQ. And I said, well, do you think you could make a neck pickup sound like a bridge pickup? And I said, well, I've never done it, but you probably could. And I don't see why you couldn't. I mean, what is the difference other than, than the response? Pretty drastic.
For some of our newer plugins, we have a hard limiter so that you can clip the output so you won't go over 0 or whatever. And the designer put in a hard limiter and a soft limiter. Neither one will go over 0. And I was trying to show people, like, what character. Well, I use that word, but what does this distortion sound like? So I plugged the guitar into it, and I just kept cranking on the. I put more and more of them in a line so that we had just piles of them, just making these like full square wave. But I started listening. I'm like, if I don't put a speaker impulse on one of these good guitar impulses or on a raw amp, it sounds a lot like this. So what happens if I put a speaker impulse? So I did. I put my favorite impulse on there for my Celestion whatever speaker. And I was like, this sounds like a guitar amp. And so I went and grabbed one of the EQ matching. Somebody made a user made EQ matcher inside Reaper, and I tried that with one of the amps that I liked, EQ, and I pretty much got it. And I'm like, not that we're about to go into guitar amp modeling, but I was surprised just how much that sounded like the distortion that I thought was so hard to get with this other amplifier.
Right.
Just EQ.
And as my friend Peter pointed out when he sent me back the matched files, that some part of it also is that Brian May was playing through an amp that was mic'd, and if that amp was 4 feet away from a wall, and it's an open back, then because you could hear some of that kind of small room ambience, a little bit of that really short echo kind of stuff adding to the character. But I mean, you could emulate that too.
I mean, an impulse will get that because you can get reverbs out of an impulse, so. Right. Yeah, it's crazy. Like and again, that's just, to me, that's like when James Randi would say, it as a musician, as a magician, you can fool the audience, but that's the hard thing. The better thing is to get them to fool themselves. And I will fool myself all the time with stuff like that, thinking it's got to be some super complicated circuit, and really it's just EQ,
Well, the bottom line for all of this, whether it's just EQ or something really complicated, is the bottom line is this is all knowable. There's no magic. There's no magic in any of this. It can be analyzed. It can be determined. There's nothing that audio engineers don't know to measure. My Null Tester proves that. And nulling has been around since the 40s. It's not like I invented that. That's how the earliest distortion analyzers worked, was by, you send 1 kilohertz through the thing you're measuring the distortion, then you null out with a twin T filter. It works by nulling. You cancel out to 1 kilohertz. You notch it out completely, and whatever is left is the distortion and noise. And that's been around since the 40s. Hewlett-Packard was one of their first pieces of test equipment. So there's nothing unknowable, and that's really the biggest myth of all to bust, is that the stuff is everything. We don't know everything. Years ago they thought that science thought the world was flat. Actually, no, the church thought the world was flat, and science got in a lot of trouble. They talk about blowback, for showing that the world is not flat. Yeah. So
that's why I say if it manifests in reality, it can probably be measured. I mean, we may not be able to measure it right now, but it can certainly be measured. And
Well, it could be measured now. It can be.
Yeah.
I mean, we can measure stuff down to, you get a $10,000 audio precision test thing. That'll measure anything down to like minus 130, 140 dB. I think minus 140, 139, somewhere around there is the limit of thermal noise, where just the noise through a piece of wire or a resistor, in the air at room temperature. That's how much noise you get. So you can't really measure much below that. But
I love it when people are talking about levels like that, because I'm like, let's see your room. Let me just take a microphone to your room and let's see what the background noise is before you're worried about minus 144 decibels summing at whatever.
Well, in the response of the room, these people obsess over the stupidest stuff, and they have no treatment in their room, no bass traps, not even basic reflection control for the early reflections on the sidewalls and ceiling. And they're arguing over how much money to spend on yet another microphone. It's the same thing with hi-fi people. They're never happy, and they're always chasing the wrong thing. They're chasing new wires. They're chasing new converters. The hi-fi people, they call them DACs, digital audio converter. It's the back half of a sound card. And you can spend $10,000. One of them is like $9,000 for the DAC and $8,000 for the power supply you have to also buy with it. And these are big modules things, with flashing lights and dials and digital readouts and crap. And I have, I don't have it here. I have a $30 clip jam media player. It's made by SanDisk, the same people that make the thumb drives. It's this big. It's the size of a book of matches. Costs $30, and when it comes with 8 gig of RAM. Will play 24-bit WAV files. So when I bought it, actually I have 2 of them now. I don't know, 3-4 years ago, I created 24-bit test tones in SoundForge, and 24 bits is not really needed for production, but you can get distortion really, really low if you generate a sine wave, algorithmically in software. So I did a sweep from 10 hertz to 20 something kilohertz. And I also tested harmonic and IM distortion. And so I created these test tones in SoundForge, copied them through USB into the media player, and then played the media player into my Focusrite high quality sound card. And they say high quality, it's not, the $300 card,
I do have the test files for those, and they are very high quality. So they're as quality as anything else. How about that?
But this $30 media player was good enough to be, I said before, audibly transparent. The distortion was way down. I mean, all the little spikes were all below 110, 120. The response was ruler flat from 10 hertz to, maybe a quarter, half dB down at the below, I forget. But I have the file somewhere. But and the noise and distortion was so far down. So that's all you need for, plus you get the whole media player with the software, and you can scroll through your things and organize by folders, and it has an FM radio in it.
Oh,
and
wow.
It goes for like 15 hours on the built-in rechargeable battery. It'll power headphones to a pretty decent volume, for $30.
So no $8,000 power supply for it even. You get your own power supply.
Well, yeah, it has internal batteries, rechargeable.
Yeah.
And
See, that's what happens if you end up testing things. You might be really upset, because it is that sunk cost kind of thing that people get upset about. But better to know. Just pull the Band-Aid off fast.
But these people, they obsess over the wrong stuff, and they don't have any acoustic treatment. And when they finally get to hear it, and I had kind of an open invitation, anybody near me in Western Connecticut, arrange to have a visit if you want to see what a good acoustically treated room sounds like. I have a modest system. I actually have a demo, a video I made of my home theater. It's about 10 minutes long in my YouTube channel, where I just show I have Mackie 624 speakers, and a killer subwoofer that does the real lifting, and 5.1 surround, and it goes to realistic rock concert levels, really clean, and sounds great. And while you're playing at that level, you can talk to the person next to you on the couch, unlike in a bar when the band is loud and you're screaming because there's so many echoes you can't hear. You could somebody talking right next to you. Yeah, you have to talk loud, but it's an amazing thing. And these people, don't know that, whether it's the home recording people or the hi-fi home theater people.
Yeah, it's some kind of thing like they can't. It's not as glamorous, but lately it's kind of changing. Like people are wanting their rooms to look a certain way, and it's not just the gear; it's the acoustics. So I think that's that's changing. It may be changing for the wrong reasons, but it's at least kind of changing. Like people are like, hey, how come you don't have, or nowadays you're even getting anti-foam snobs. They're like, oh, well, those guys got like regular foam in their room. That's not, and they're not even like audio guys. But they want these panel traps now, which is kind of, I don't know where they saw it. They must have saw it on somebody's Nickelodeon room or something. But they're starting to get that way, which is nice. Let's see. I think it's about to be drum lessons around here, so it's going to get too loud to do anything. And I had you on for an hour, but man, I really want to, if we can, do some kind of like weekly or monthly roundtable. There's a bunch of guys who would like to participate, and we can. We got all kinds of subjects. We can do the Muppet Show, vultures sitting in the back, heckling everything about.
Right. Well, I'd be happy to either answer questions or debate someone who's on the opposite side. I'd be happy to do that as long as I know what the subject is. I'll prepare some graphs and tables and charts. So I can talk the stuff off the top of my head because I know it cold. I've been doing this for so many years. But I'd be happy to do either of those.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. But then I'm gonna clean this one up, and I'll let you know when I have it ready. But yeah, it's about to get crazy loud in here. Like I have decent treatment in my stuff, but there is Zippo for isolation between these rooms, man.
Well, that's a whole other thing. And I don't know what video editing software you use, but
I'm a big Vegas nut. You can tell because the first versions of Reaper pretty much look like a like Vegas for the most part, So
I love Vegas. There's always been kind of bugs. I'm still at version 11 or 12. They're up to 15 or something because it already does more than I need.
Yeah. At Vegas 2, it did pretty much all the video editing I needed in real time, unlike the rest of the stuff out there. So.
Yeah. Well, I think I joined in version 4 or something. But that's my main program. I love it. It's really easy. I love the Sonic Foundry stuff. The interface, really, really nice. Me and
the other developers were huge Vegas fans. We just wanted some more routing, and we wanted a couple of things that the audio engineers wanted. I was anyway. I was on the beta team for Vegas, and I would beg them every time I got to talk to them, like, please just add some. Well, we're really doing it a video direction. I'm like, what? It's not going to hurt you to do both, But I mean, still, if I'm going to edit video, I'm going to use. I love Vegas, I really love all those guys. The developers were all good. I don't really know any of the Magix guys, but all the guys who developed the original algorithms and especially the user interface, they were all really cool people. So all the Sonic Foundry stuff just really brought us into that world, to me. Those are my heroes.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I mean, even the original SoundForge, which is the first product, was just so easy to use and did so much. And that's also my main audio editor.
Wow. That's cool.
Well, I mean, that's not my DAW. I don't use that for multi-track. I still use Sonar 8. When they came out with the X1 stuff, it was, everybody said, it's a whole new learning curve. Well, who needs that? And the great thing about that, the Sonar, is that it's you get a serial number and a registration code, and they're out of business now. Well, they're back with, but I just got a new computer and no problem installing it.
Wow.
Didn't have to call home.
Don't have to subscribe.
Website. Right. That's a problem with the Vegas stuff, opposed to that kind of copy protection. But what are you going to do? Well, all right. Well, this was fun, and email me or PM me or something when if you put it on YouTube or when it's out. And
cool. Thank you very much. I'll let you know when we're really getting together again. Most of the guys that nowadays they're younger engineers that I can't tell when I work on their stuff whether it's right or wrong because it's that crazy. But they have a lot to say and they got a lot of questions for you. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm happy to do questions. I can't do this every week. But yeah, I'm happy to do it again.
Cool. Yeah, I'll let you know.
All right, man.
So thanks a billion, and nice to finally talk to you face to face ish. Yeah. All right. I'll see you later.
All right. See ya. Bye.
All right. Thanks everybody who tuned in, made it to the end, especially. That was a long one, but I've been trying to get Ethan Weiner on for a while. And so if you haven't already, please subscribe wherever you are, the AIX DSP channel or the Pipeline Audio YouTube channel. And